Dr. Christopher Walling, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's really good to have you here. Turns out we know a number of people in common, even though you and I have never met in person, but
Right.
you are on the faculty among all the other things that you're doing. You're on faculty, is that right, at Pacifica?
No, Pacifica is actually just a member institution of the
Okay,
U.S. Association for Body Psychotherapy.
okay.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about that. But
yeah,
before we get into the association stuff, let's talk more generally about body psychotherapies.
sure.
And even before we get into that, let's talk about you and your background and how you got into this kind of work.
Sure. So my entree into body psychotherapy actually began in the world of yoga therapy. I spent a number of years training with various yoga therapy schools throughout the world, in Sweden, in New York, and here in LA where I live. And that led me also to ask a lot of questions to some of the faculty that I was working with at the time. I was the executive administrator for geriatric psychiatry at UCLA. And we
So that
had
was before you got involved with the yoga, or at the same time?
simultaneously, it was actually
Yeah, okay.
simultaneously. And we had a private investigator, a PI there, who was a psychiatrist and a researcher, who was really interested in the applications of yoga therapy on geriatric depression. And that led to my diving even further into the explorations of yoga as a form of psychotherapy.
Yes.
And then that led me into the world of exploring a whole lot of folks at Esalen and in the humanistic traditions who had somatic approaches. And then I trained for a number of years in Peter Levine's tradition in somatic experiencing.
Well, that's a great background. Now, I want to ask you about yoga therapy. I have heard that concept before, interviewed one other person who was billing herself as a yoga therapist. And my first reaction was yoga therapy. I mean, I studied yoga when it was called yoga.
Right, right.
So what's the difference between yoga and yoga therapy? At what point does it become a psychotherapy?
Yeah, I think that really depends upon the scope of practice of the actual clinician who's using yogic techniques as a part of their clinical interventions. And so, in some ways, yoga therapy may be defined as simply the application of yogic principles to a particular person based on the particular specialty at hand. So, obviously, in a mental health capacity, that's going to have factors around self regulation, the overall level of embodiment, and whether or not the patient or the client has a capacity for being able to stay present to their physiology or present to their sensory awareness.
Would that tend to be more a one-on-one kind of situation then, where it's really
It would.
tailored to that person?
It would. It would indeed.
Is anybody doing what could be called group yoga therapy?
Oh, for sure. And this often tends to be sort of folks who are more interested in both what are often called sort of the asana portion as well as the pranayama portions, where there is some kind of movement that's involved. But there is actually an academic journal for yoga therapy that's published by the International Association of Yoga Therapists that publishes a lot of various journal articles on yoga therapeutic techniques as they relate to the mental health field. And many of those will discuss both group and individual formats. There's even a number of training programs that are beginning to form at accredited universities. For example, here locally in LA, Loyola Marymount University has a clinical yoga therapy training program
Hmm.
where marriage and family therapists can learn yoga therapy simultaneously throughout their graduate training.
Wow, that's very interesting to see how it has been evolving over
Mm-hmm.
the years and developing down this particular distinctive channel. And I just
Mm-hmm.
want to back up in case anybody didn't know the reference to asanas and pranayama, that the one
Sure.
refers to body positions, postures, and the other to breathing techniques, right?
Right. That's correct.
Okay, yeah. So Now, I just have to, you mentioned private eye, and you sort of glossed right over that. Where does a private eye fit into a program in geriatrics and yoga?
Private eye meaning?
I thought you said when you were telling me about your work, your medical work at the Geriatric Institute,
Mhm.
I
Oh,
thought
private investigator, a private investigator.
oh, yeah, you said
Yeah,
PI, private investigator. So
yeah.
I'm jumping right away to the crime genre. And you're talking
Yeah,
about the research genre.
that's right. That's right. That's right.
The
That's where I spent much of my beginnings, was actually as a biomedical academic administrator. So I've been at various universities for at least around a decade prior to becoming a private practice psychologist, helping with the administration of both the research, clinical, and education missions of the various universities. And my last appointment was at UCLA in the geriatric psychiatry division.
Wow, what a great background. And it's easy to see why they elected you as president for this association,
Thank you.
because you've got the breadth of experience and understanding and context.
Hmm.
And that seems really important.
Hmm.
And when I, just so that we're all on board, when I say the word body therapy,
Hmm.
what comes to mind? There are a number of things that are called body therapies right now. So if you could
Sure.
just rattle off every one of those that comes to mind.
Well, there are hundreds.
Hundreds. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
literally. A first characterization of body psychotherapy, I would suppose, is to include in that category all forms of psychotherapy that explicitly use body techniques to strengthen a dialogue between the patient and the therapist. Essentially about like what is happening and what is being experienced and perceived. And in most techniques or schools of body psychotherapy, the body is considered a means of communication or of exploration, just as complex and rich as our verbal communication would be. So the body is really no longer experienced per se as kind of a object of awareness, but more as an aspect of awareness. And that really creates the many complexities and the rich traditions that have been around in some instances even prior to Freud. So, when you think about conventional psychotherapy, particularly um, in a classical psychotherapy, there would always be an explicit access of verbal communication, but then an implicit process that typically in analytic terms would be described in the boundaries of transference and countertransference. Whereas in body psychotherapy, the approach integrates the two dimensions of explicit and implicit processes, but there's an explicit exploration of behavior itself. So the therapist serves as kind of a mirror, describes the way that he or she perceives the patient's behavior, and also asks the patient to sort of explore what is happening when he or she tries to behave differently. And the utilization of a body technique that might have come from a multidisciplinary range of fields, not just yoga therapy, but physical therapy, dance, sports, any kind of movement. That then becomes the interactive modality. So essentially, body psychotherapists are using somatic attunement skills really to deepen the awareness of both themselves and their clients as bodies.
Yeah. So mention some of the specific schools or techniques, if you will. For example, you
Sure.
mentioned dance therapy.
Hmm.
I'm thinking of bioenergetics.
That's right.
Uh,
Yeah.
keep going. Some more.
Yeah. So, any neo-Reichian approach to psychotherapy, some of our sponsors for our upcoming biennial conference this year would be folks like sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, Hakomi. We also have traditions like bioenergetics or biodynamic psychotherapy. And so, yes, body psychotherapy in a contemporary sense, like in Europe, there literally are nearly 200 various different training programs that identify with the European Association of Body Psychotherapy as a body psychotherapy school or training program. And whether it's the bioenergetic analysis that Lowen had created, who was a patient of Wilhelm Reich's, or the Danish-based Bodynamics, which was Gerda Boysen's biodynamic psychology, Ron Kurtz, who created Hakomi, John Parakos, who created core energetics, Jay Statman, who created unitive psychology, Malcolm Brown, who created organismic psychotherapy. All of these folks create this rich umbrella of a community, many of whom can really trace their beginnings back to Reich, and sort of his voice in overall character analysis is where it all began with vegetotherapy.
Yeah, yeah. He talked about character armor, that
That's right.
that our psychological defenses become so over practiced, if you will, that they
Sure.
begin to show up in our posture and our
Mhm.
musculature and
Mhm.
connective tissue too, I guess.
Mhm.
And
That's
so
right.
that's kind of the main river, the main stream, and a lot of offshoots, a lot of
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
and
I also, as you were talking, I was remembering Arthur Janov and the Primal Scream, that
that's right.
was actually interviewed him not long ago, and his wife, and that was very much a bodily approach. And I'm sure there were a lot of related approaches that spun off of that.
That's right. That's right. So it's a really rich school of thought, and many types of body work and somatic therapies maintain this kind of holistic approach that aims at integrating body mind processes with their clients. And a lot of them borrow and co-create and co-inform one another, both pedagogically in terms of how we train therapists, as well as clinically in terms of how we treat patients.
Yeah, yeah. What about the issue of touch and manipulation? I would think that would be a major divide, that some would be observing, talking about, but at a little bit of a distance, whereas others might involve the therapist actually touching, manipulating, gouging,
Yeah,
twisting, turning.
right. As a membership organization within USABP, we do a lot of education around touch and body psychotherapy, because touch is really the first language of the body. And so you're correct. There are schools of thought where touch is an integral component of how the therapy is performed. And there may be others that, because of their scope of practice or because of their training, touch is not a part of it. But touch is an essential component in many somatic traditions, because in some ways, it's one of the best ways to access the body itself vis-a-vis sort of that supreme primary language of touch, and to essentially get a right hemisphere to right hemisphere connection, to get a right brain to right brain dialectic to unfold, which doesn't require the left hemisphere to participate, which is really helpful in so many psychological phenomenon.
So what you're saying is that the therapist and client are intuitively connected rather than mainly in a verbal kind of way, that they're
Correct. Correct.
working at a very instinctual, intuitive level and
That's right.
experiencing at that level. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And of course, we're in the US, maybe more than in Europe, I'm not sure. We're kind of squeamish about touching.
That's correct.
What comes to mind is the US just said no breastfeeding in public, right?
Right. Right. That's
And
correct.
all of Europe is shocked, what? So
Yeah.
our puritanical tradition, it seems like, just won't go away.
That's right. Yeah, one of my favorite programs on touch and its applications in psychotherapy and counseling comes from Ofer Zuer's institute, his online institute. He has a whole course on the ethics of touch and psychotherapy. And, you know, Zuer and many sort of psychotherapeutic ethicists and those who want to talk about the use of touch will often say, like, look, it's not touch that really is the ethical issue in most therapies. It's often the therapies themselves that don't really have a coherent evidence base that folks need to be worried about when it comes to taboos or ethics. But you're correct. So much of the need for touch remains unsatisfied. And as a result, abnormal behavior follows. And so, in some ways, the most supportive therapy that we can often provide as healers is to introduce the idea of connection through touch.
Okay. Well, we've sort of been doing this already, but I'm hoping you can give us an overview of somatic approaches as they've evolved over the past 30 or 40 years.
Sure, sure. So, really, despite the fact that somatic aspects of our psyche um, have been sort of thoroughly discussed in the psychoanalytic literature since the days of Freud. And even though body psychotherapy has presented sort of this practice in the 20th century as a distinct field, um, it it really has flourished, I would say, in the last 10 years or so, in large part thanks to neuroscience. Because I believe if there's anything that we've learned, as self-serving as this might sound as a body psychotherapist, and I was discussing this with some colleagues yesterday, is that we've just learned in the last 10 years or so that we've been right all along. And that's really nice of us to be able to have that validation,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because that's essentially what the neuroscience has led us to conclude in recent years, is that, you know, the imaging studies that we've been able to gain insight in terms of our underlying interpersonal neurobiology has really led us to understand that the right hemisphere in particular has these affective processes that operate at levels beneath our conscious awareness, and that is dominant in both development, psychopathogenesis, and certainly in psychotherapy. One of my mentors, Alan Shore, has, often said that really great psychotherapy is a right brain to right brain connection. And so much of our understanding of the unconscious in recent years has, particularly in the last 2 or 3 decades, offered clinical and research evidence that indicates that really the right brain is the psychobiological substrate of the human unconscious. And thus, often the best way to really access unconscious emotional memories, to work with autobiographical memory and early attachment traumas, is through the body. And so, while the beginnings of our traditions in body psychotherapy might have begun with Reich, in recent years, they've exploded thanks to all of the insights that we've discovered from Shore's work and Porges's work and Dan Siegel's work, who have given further evidence base to something that we've been doing for decades now in our traditions.
That's really fascinating. I had not put that together in my own mind. I think there are other traditions that are also feeling very validated,
That's
like
right.
the
That's
whole
right.
meditative tradition is saying,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, this is what we've been saying, and now you're just finding the correlations going on in the brain.
That's right. That's
And
right.
and talk therapy, even talk therapy now saying, well, talk therapy changes the brain. So
Right.
it's not like it's just, you know, empty talking. It's actually affecting the person at a
Sure.
neurological level.
Sure. Really, what we're thinking of in body psychotherapy is really around the idea of transformation. I mean, even me taking a sip of my cup of water will change my brain. But from a perspective of actually supporting patients to be able to overcome psychological issues, to be able to reduce their suffering, this is really the hallmark of great body psychotherapy, is its capacity for transformation. And so often, even as a private practice psychologist, I'll get referrals from other therapists that say, this patient's been with me for a year or 2 years and we're not really getting anywhere. And I believe that they need some somatic work. And that's where we kind of come in as body psychotherapists, is that we often show up because there's an impasse in some of the patient's clinical work, that the only way to get to it is to bypass some of the left brain verbal issues and to tap into that right brain therapeutic enactment.
Is there an example of that in your own practice that comes to mind, without breaking confidentiality?
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of folks, as do many somatic psychotherapists, who have a history of developmental trauma. And oftentimes, because those types of traumas were experienced by the individual even before they had words that were pre-verbal states, let's say, for example, they really aren't able to access some of that material through simple narrative. So assessing for a conventional coherent narrative as an indicator of psychological well-being will be useless. And so really the only way to access that is often through supporting their experience in the here and now, which does borrow, as you might imagine, from other traditions such as mindfulness. Because in that instance, as we step into a direct sort of observation or witnessing of their sensory awareness, there's really nothing to talk about. There's nothing to really teach. It's just the activity of experiencing and working with being more present for the moment. But in doing so, that's allowed some of my clients to be able to essentially renegotiate a lot of incomplete developmental processes that now that they have agency and they're under less threat, they're actually able to complete and to work through as they become more fully present and responsive to their lives.
Yeah, the idea of developmental trauma, that's sort of a fairly new field as well, having to do with the impact of things like sort of major blockages in how the young child is nurtured or
Yeah,
tortured or sexually abused, et cetera, and that this has a lasting impact.
that's
And
right.
that kind of thing, just talking about it isn't as likely to get into it as some form of body, manipulation or.
Or just sensory exploration
Mhm.
of what it's like for someone to really stay present to what their embodied experience is like. It was actually Winnicott, I believe, who claimed that the mind was not a separate entity, but instead the mind is no more than a special case of functioning of the psyche and the soma together, that one can really look at the developing body um, coinciding with the developing psyche. Clinically, what we might see developmental trauma as in a sort of diagnostic category would be what is often called complex PTSD, which results from, of course, ongoing repetitive exposure to traumatizing, highly stressful situations. And its signs and symptoms can vary, but generally what's pervasive is often a really difficult experience around the person's level of vigilance, their capacity to feel safe in social situations or in relational situations. And so oftentimes the beginnings of that kind of a treatment would really begin by supporting the person's capacity for staying oriented and staying in the present moment without feeling like they're under threat.
Uh-huh. So how would you do that specifically?
Well, every tradition that supports that does it through some mechanism of exploratory inquiry, which is essentially a fancy way of saying what we used to call free association, right?
Oh,
which
okay.
is which is inviting someone to essentially, maybe even if they come into my office here, to just take a look around the room and see what they notice, and to allow them to sort of have a free range of noticing where their attention may go. And in the process of doing that, then inviting them to actually notice what happens on the inside as they pay attention to the outside. And just supporting that dialectic between the internal and the external world begins the unfolding of even their capacity to differentiate between what we might call me or not me states, which is at the foundation of where identity formation and a sense of self really begins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have the impression, and I don't know where I get this impression from, that body therapy might be bigger in Europe than in this country.
Well, it is. And in part, I suppose that's because they got themselves organized a lot sooner than we might have here in the
Huh.
States. The US Association for Body Psychotherapy formed in the late 90s, and the Europeans were already onto it for about a decade, at least in terms of a formal professional association. But I think that's in large part because of the Austrian roots of many of the schools of psychoanalytic thought that were inspired by Reich, and the fact that there was really already an established base that was researching and looking into some of the techniques that Reich had created and how they can apply to a larger field of psychoanalytic thought or psychotherapeutic technique.
Yeah, earlier you said something about evidence-based, and I'm curious about how body therapies have risen to that challenge, because that's not where they start. Well, in a
Right,
sense, everybody is working on evidence of the
right,
evidence of their eyes and their experience with other people, but rising to the research, the rigorous research requirements to qualify as evidence-based.
right.
Is that, I gather from what you've said, that maybe that is starting to happen or has been happening for a while with body therapy?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is an institutional demand, and obviously, it's informed by my background as an academic executive, and so certainly because of our field and the way that it operates, trying to impose an ethic of knowledge that is as scientific as possible, we have succumbed to really trying to examine how we do clinical practice, as you know, from this idea of an evidence-based therapy, which conventionally often has only referred to cognitive-based therapies. And from our perspective, what we really consider to be evidence-based can be something as simple as a peer-reviewed clinical case study. We, along with the European Association of Body Psychotherapy, for a number of years, have published the world's only peer-reviewed journal, the International Body Psychotherapy Journal. It's published twice a year. And the journal, its whole goal is to promote and stimulate the exchange of ideas and scholarship and research in body psychotherapy, as well as to sort of encourage the interdisciplinary exchange within the fields of both clinical theory and practice. And it's through that dialectic, through that sort of peer-reviewed process, that we're really trying to promote clinically based psychotherapies. And this is largely what most of psychodynamic work, Jungian work, Gestalt, and body psychotherapy alike really are operating from, is a clinically based informed approach. And to that end, that's what we are hoping to foster and support through our efforts in the publication of our journal.
Yeah, that's fascinating that things are going that way. And also, it sounds like uh, people have had to dig in their heels around the issue of what constitutes evidence.
That's correct. That's correct. And it will be an ongoing dialogue because,
Mhm.
as you know, research in the area of psychotherapy can be challenging because it's really difficult to create sort of the classical randomized clinical trial model for any kind of psychotherapy because of just the research design difficulties that people face.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, it would be nice, say, as a consumer, to know that there's some evidence that there were some studies where X number of people came in with Y problem,
That's right.
and Z number at the end seemed transformed in some way.
That's right. That's right.
And those kinds of studies are happening now around the various body therapies.
That is correct. In fact, there's even that gold standard randomized controlled clinical trial studies that we're seeing published in journals around many of the traditions that are a part of the body psychotherapy community, including somatic experiencing, who had an RCT, and I believe so did Hakomi. Psychotherapy has had an RCT as well.
Tell me a bit more about Hakomi. That's one of the things that's kind of come in that's under my radar.
Uh-huh.
I've
Uh-huh.
heard many references to it, and how the name Hakomi sounds Japanese, but maybe it's
Right.
not.
Right. Well, the Hakomi method of experiential psychotherapy is a body-based psychotherapy that was developed by Ron Kurtz. And it combines somatic awareness with experiential techniques to promote psychological growth. And so the theory holds that of Hakomi that the body to be sort of a window to the unconscious, as I was talking about. And so Hakomi integrates principles of Eastern philosophy, primarily of Taoism and Buddhism. And it emphasizes concepts such as mindfulness, loving presence, and empathy, all of which inspired Kurtz. And so it really is a synthesis between mindfulness-based psychotherapy and psychomotor types of psychotherapies, as well as Reiki and breath work, um, Ginlin's focusing methodologies, structural body work, some neuro-linguistic programming put in there, and a little bit of Gestalt as well.
My goodness.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I heard of a Hakomi faculty member once comment that, really Hakomi therapy is about what can we borrow next. Um,
Right.
because it's all in service to really
Uh-huh.
the patient and to providing them with the best possible comprehensive therapy.
Is there some central ingredient such that if I were a fly on the wall and I happened to fly into the office of a Hakomi therapist, what would I see that would tell me, oh, this is a Hakomi that's going on here?
Yeah, well, it might be in some of the languaging, perhaps it depends. I think that Hakomi, much like all forms of body psychotherapy, one of the hallmarks would be what you would notice is a profound psychotherapeutic attunement between the body psychotherapist and the patient, both within the therapist's own body and the patient's body. And that being kind of a central, informative, useful focus that the two are really utilizing to really shape and inform the moment-to-moment exploration of the patient's experience. Furthermore, Hakomi loves to sort of use the idea of an experiment, which, conventionally we might have called, a corrective experience or an enactment. But Hakomi experiments are really the invitation of the exploratory awareness for the individual patient to perhaps open up to and be curious about what's happening in their awareness. And we've discovered throughout body psychotherapy that if there's one sort of supportive element that really allows the therapy to unfold, it is curiosity. And that's essentially what all body psychotherapists are trying to promote for the patient.
In the Hakomi method, as a fly on the wall, would I see the client seated or lying on a couch or lying on the floor or what?
All of the above.
All
You
of
would
the
see all of the above.
above. Okay. Okay. There was another thought. In the process of learning over the past 30 or 40 years, is there anything that's been learned in terms of recognizing that something was a mistake? We were mistaken to think, or we were mistaken to do.
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, it goes back to our origin stories because in some ways, body psychotherapy, while it's been inspired by Reich's work, it's also suffered from it because the shifting political moralities of the 1930s and the work in Norway until 39 came a number of sort of streams of body psychotherapy that some of which sort of lasted and were able to make the muster of time, and others kind of went to the wayside based on sort of orgone therapy ideas and the like. And so, this is a big umbrella, obviously. It's as big as humanistic traditions that in some ways have informed body psychotherapy. It's as big as psychodynamic traditions. And so because it's an umbrella community, there are many therapies that have not stood the test of time because the evolving sort of clinical applications didn't quite work out. And I think that's true for all of the practice of psychotherapy, and that's why we call it a practice and not a surgery.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the test of time as the filter.
Right, right.
What survives
That's right.
is of value, and some stuff doesn't survive because it just wasn't efficacious enough to really sustain itself.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. That's an interesting take on that. And well, it's exciting to me to hear how all of this is evolving. As a young professor, I had an intuition 30, 40 years ago
Mm-hmm.
that there was this holistic possibility. And I taught a course at Sonoma State University called Psychology and the Body. And I would invite a wide variety of body workers to come in. and demonstrate what they do and so on. And I
Mhm.
was not able to, for myself, articulate any kind of written book or overall synthesis to pull it all together. For me, it was more of an intuitive sensing that this is an important place to go. And
Absolutely.
I did,
Absolutely.
I was doing clinical work in the beginning, and I was experimenting with some of these techniques and trying to bring them into therapy.
Good for
And
you.
then,
What were your results?
um, well, at times they were powerful. It's also
Mhm.
so I wasn't systematic, and so it's hard for me to give a good answer to that question.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I'm blocking on the name of the book that I want. Bodies in Revolt. Tom Hanna, I think, wrote one of the early books that, for me, uh, really began to articulate what I felt was possible here.
Right, right.
Is
Well,
his name around these days?
you
You
still
know
see
that
it
book?
referenced,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Um, but this is a hunch that I think anyone who's been in the psychotherapist chair for very long begins to start to come into an encounter with, because it's embedded in our very construct of both mind and what is mind and body. And even Galileo and Newton would use the term body to designate any material object that could be perceived or weighed out. And even a star seen from far away, or a stone or a plant, was a body.
Hmm.
And so mechanics really is a science that attempts to describe and predict behavior of inanimate bodies. And the term body was used to sort of designate animated entities. And so an individual plant or an animal is a body. And so really looking at the dimensions of us as organisms will absolutely lead to an exploration of what is the experience of having a body. And it's been our experience, I believe, if I can be so bold as to speak for an entire profession of people, which is quite arrogant of me, but I would say that the further embodied that we become, the more coherent and the more at ease that we become. And that there really is sort of embedded in this experiential aspect of our sensory awareness, where we come into a kind of an alignment with being, and that is at sort of its core the hallmark of psychological well-being.
Yeah. Sensory awareness triggers recollections of people you mentioned Esalen earlier, and
That's right.
Esalen certainly was a melting pot where a lot of this stuff was starting to emerge, and the name Charlotte Selver comes
That's
back.
right. That's right. Charlotte is
Uh,
actually one of Charlotte's trainers, is our honoree this year for the Lifetime Achievement Award, Dr. Judith Weaver. And Judith taught within Charlotte's system for a while and was a student of Charlotte's. For your listeners who might not know, Charlotte Selver was a pioneer in human potential. And she spoke against compartmentalizing humans into bodies or minds. And she wanted to focus on this idea of a unified organismic human being. And the aim of sensory awareness approaches was to make it possible for a person to re-experience themselves as a totality, to bring them back into a direct experience of their own aliveness and the receptivity of which that we're all capable. And so she coined that phrase, sensory awareness, you're correct, in the 60s at Esalen. And she was actually one of the first people to offer an experiential workshop at Esalen.
yes, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
good.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are the controversies or hot button issues in this field? I mean, there's always some controversy going on, right? When we're
Well,
talking human beings.
yeah. I mean, we're no different than any other field of science, right?
Yeah.
In that we have ongoing debates, um, and we have all of our pet theories that are precious to us. And I think as a result, there is always an ongoing intellectual dialogue around, the theories that we hold to be true. For example, theories that have informed me as a clinician, obviously, are affect regulation theory that was coined by Alan Shore. And polyvagal theory, which is, of course, the work of Steve Porges. But we must accept that these are theories, and theories are best guesses, that we really have at explaining a phenomenology. But we have sort of this thing that happens with theory, that when it really matches our experience, we get really excited. And I think that's really where the current hot buttons are, is there's all of this ongoing dialogue right now around interpersonal neurobiology, around polyvagal theory, around affect regulation theory. And we're sort of testing it both clinically and within our research and our academic pursuits to sort of further explore the efficacy of these ideas.
Yeah, just the interview that I did just before yours interview here, last week's interview was with Deb Dana, who's written a book grounding polyvagal theory into clinical practice.
Yes.
Which I was intrigued when I saw that title. I said, geez, I want to interview this person to see this,
I think she's connected with Steve through the Kinsey Institute in some way.
Yes.
Which is where Steve and Sue both are now.
Yeah. So, and I've just finished reading Michael Pollard's book on psychedelics, How to Change Your Mind, I think is the title, which is a great double entendre title. It seems like such an innocent title,
Right.
And it has such profound consequences and possibilities. And it occurs to me that, would we call that a body therapy?
Perhaps not in sort of our conventional understanding of body psychotherapy, and in that it's more of a pharmacogenic therapy. Obviously, it's changing chemistry more than it is inviting conscious awareness of experience per se, from an embodiment perspective. But there's no question that I could see certainly one arguing that, given the preliminary sort of data that folks are discussing at symposia, even as recent here at UCLA, they had a symposium on psychedelics and their therapeutic applications, that it does essentially renegotiate the mind-body relationship and support kind of a new organizing state of consciousness. And so I don't have any direct experience with folks who are doing that kind of research, and it's certainly not a part of what we're seeing in our organization, because it doesn't really align with kind of where our schools of thought are. But there's absolutely some overlap, as there are amongst most therapies, I would imagine.
Sure. And if I allow myself to go intuitive, I think I would see down the line perhaps some kind of a merger there where people are using this altered state of consciousness to work in bodily ways with someone, assuming that it doesn't get all shut down like it did in the past.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this association that you are the president of.
Sure.
I know that that's part of the motivation for us getting together today. And also you have an upcoming conference. So tell us, it's called the United States Association for Body Psychotherapy.
Right.
So what's the mission? What's the mission, et cetera?
Our mission is just that we believe that the integration of the body and mind is essential to effective psychotherapeutic health. And so to that end, our only mission is to develop and advance the art, science, and practice of body psychotherapy and somatic psychology. And so to that end, we support professional, ethical, standard developments and membership to promote the health and welfare of both our clients and our clinician members. And so we have somatic practitioner members who might not necessarily be a licensed mental health professional, but who would perhaps be a licensed body worker. And we also have clinical members. And then we have institutional members, and these are senior parent sort of training institutes or universities that actually have somatic psychotherapy degree granting programs. And this could be, like Naropa University, Pacifica Graduate Institute, the California Institute of Integral Studies up in San Francisco. These are some of our university programs. And then our training and certification programs are folks like the Bodynamic Institute of USA, the Center for Somatic Studies, which is Ruella Frank, core energetics, Hakomi, somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, and many, many, many more, Alexander Lowen Foundation, et cetera. Most of our organizations are, of course, training institutes in some ways. They all have various different sort of approaches, as we were discussing, but we serve as kind of the umbrella hub that publishes the academic journal that these kinds of training programs can publish into, and also provides networking opportunities and obviously a biennial conference, which you mentioned. So that conference is, in some ways, according to this board, what we believe to be the Woodstock of body psychotherapy. That's sort of our goal.
Biennial, but there's biennial and biannual, right?
Right.
What is biennial? I get mixed up.
Every 2 years.
Okay, thank you.
The conference is every 2 years, as opposed to twice a year, which would be biannual. So,
okay.
So every 2 years we get together. You know, we honor some of the sort of grandfathers and grandmothers of our traditions, and we collaborate around the latest and greatest in new research, and we share in, you know, plenary and outbreak sessions from our various traditions. And so this year, there's around 80 different presentations from
Wow.
nearly 20 different schools. Our keynote address is given by my mentor, Dr. Alan Shore. We're honoring Dr. Stephen Porges and Dr. Judith Weaver, and all of it will take place in front of the beauty of the Pacific Ocean in Santa Barbara at Pacifica in November.
Wow. Yeah, in November, how many days does it run?
It's the first weekend in November. There's a pre-conference on November 1st, which is a Thursday, but the proper conference begins Friday, November the 2nd, and runs until Sunday the 4th. So it's a weekend event. And we do that because we're all clinicians and we're all volunteers. And so we all kind of know that getting away for a conference can be demanding for psychotherapists. So we try to jam it all in, which creates a lot of anxiety because there's usually 5 different things happening at once that you want to go to all of them.
Yeah, right. Right. That's so frustrating. I've experienced that at many conferences.
Yeah.
And so you're off in the corner saying, "Who's good?"
That's right. That's right. And to me, that's the hallmark of a good conference is when there's that kind of pressure to really sort of explore. That gives you an indication there's real learning happening.
Yeah, yeah. And how many members are there in the organization?
Yeah, so a clinical membership ranges, usually it depends from year to year and where things are renewing, but we have right now around 350 members that's on the rosters. And that can fluctuate. Some years we can have 400 and something, 500, and some years it can go a little bit lower. So, you know, in terms of professional associations, as far as that goes, a relatively small association, but a very large kind of organizational presence, if you think about all of the institutional members across the nearly 20 or so organizations that participate with us.
Yeah, and is there a corresponding European organization? And
There
do you
is.
guys ever get together and have a joint conference?
We've never done a joint conference, but that's a brilliant idea. We've often just held our own conferences and cross-pollinated one another. And so, for example, I'll be going to Europe in September to Berlin for their conference. And this is their 16th conference that they've held. And this year they're focusing on alienation, vitality, and flow. That's their theme. And ours is around relational themes of body psychotherapy. But yeah, we essentially come and speak at each other's conferences. And of course, we publish a journal together. And that's the extent of our collaboration thus far. But I love the idea of a joint conference.
Well, I'm drawing on my own experience. One of the hats I wear is that of a qualitative market research consultant. And so one of the organizations I belong to, QRCA, Qualitative Research Consultants Association, there's another group, and I'm forgetting their name, in Europe, that's the same kind. So every second year they have a joint conference sometimes, and it alternates, I think, between being in this country and being in some European country. It's a ton of work to pull it all together.
Oh,
they're both,
trust me, I
they're
know.
both run on volunteer
Yeah.
energy, but
Yeah.
it'd be very stimulating.
when we were designing this conference, we really took a look at the overall culture of where we are in the United States right now. And to that end, what we saw is that we're living in a time right now of perhaps a unprecedented level of conflict that is often only seen at times of war. And so our hope was to create a conference theme that would actually provide supportive educational themes that would allow us to address what's happening on the cultural level through the individual work that we often do. And so we were looking at how do we foster the repair of so much disconnection. And our
Mhm.
aim through this conference was to highlight both the science and the practice of how embodied self-awareness would promote this capacity for connection in both our clients and ourselves. And so every speaker was invited to present around these relational approaches that would galvanize restorative properties of our vitality, and that most importantly would normalize human needs. And so to that end, we have panels on trauma, on death and dying, on breakout sessions on the use of movement in psychotherapeutic praxis, sessions on working with infants in body psychotherapy, a great big afternoon on sexuality and health, and of course, interpersonal neurobiology is an organizing theme given our keynoter and our honoree. So that really is why we're calling it the Woodstock of body psychotherapy,
Yeah.
because it's an ambitious goal for a conference.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Well, it sounds like it's going to be a very exciting conference. And it sounds like if there are any people in my listenership, viewership that are wanting to know more about body therapy or wanting to define their own work or future career in that direction, this would be a great thing to go to.
That's right.
You can
That's
get
right.
exposed to a lot of different approaches and maybe meet some of the key people in those approaches
That's right.
and find out about the various education programs, because you've indicated that there are a lot of different places a person could go for education.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dr. Christopher Walling, I really want to thank you for being my guest on Shrink Wrap Radio and
Or it
sharing this smorgasbord with us.
Well, it was a pleasure, Dr. Dave, and I hope to maybe see you at Pacifica this fall, or certainly to meet some of your listeners there.